All right, in this part 3 of the Punic Wars and Roman expansion, we're going to look at what was going on back in Spain while Hannibal was ravaging Italy. In order to do that, we need to talk about the Scipios, who had headed over to Spain. That was Publius and Gnaeus Scipio, and they were active there for several years, in fact, about 7 years or so. They were incredibly active, fighting against Hasdrubal and his supply lines. And this was important because it kept Hannibal from having decent resupply from Spain, which connected him back to more men, better supplies, all the way through northern Italy, across southern France, and down into Spain. And so this is what the two generals, Publius and Gnaeus, ended up doing, fighting against him. In fact, they were much better to the local Spanish population than the Carthaginians had been, the Barcas, and a lot of tribes, Spanish tribes, begin to ally with the Scipios. So Publius and Gnaeus are making incredible inroads there, which gives the Romans access to more men, more support, more supplies. They're able to use that effectively against the Carthaginians, and in fact, they were able to recapture the city of Saguntum from the Carthaginians in Spain. Unfortunately, by 211, though, both Publius and Gnaeus were killed, and their armies were destroyed by a resurgent Hasdrubal and the Carthaginians, and that created a lot of worry in Rome. Even though Rome was on the offensive back in Italy, it still created some major problems back there, because now you had two major generals killed, and their armies were completely wiped out. So these were some serious setbacks in Spain. Well, it was up to the son and nephew of Publius and Gnaeus, so one was the father, the other was the uncle. It was up to a young Publius Cornelius Scipio to take care of business in Spain, and he did that rather effectively. So Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of one of the other Scipios, he was actually granted, he's too young, he only had one elective office. He was actually granted the extraordinary measure, it was called proconsular imperium, and this allowed him to lead troops, even though he was not of the proper office for that, and he had not risen up through the ranks, but he had all these connections to the army he had served, and he was beloved both by the Spanish and the people. And this actually was seen in his leadership qualities when he decided to go against the city of New Carthage, Carthago Novo, in 209. This was a city that was heavily fortified and defended with walls, but there wasn't a lot of defenses on the sea side of the city, of the fort, because the ocean there was incredibly deep. But apparently one day, Scipio noticed that the winds were blowing incredibly strong to the north, and it was actually blowing the water away from the north winds were blowing the water away from the seawall itself. And so he took his men, and they waded through what essentially was no water at all, to an undefended part of the city. They scaled the walls, and they took the city. And this actually was the fact that it seems like the gods were favoring Scipio really worked to his benefit in terms of leadership. This began a long series of even more successes in Italy, and this gave in Spain, and this gave the Romans access to Spanish resources. And so these things included men. Scipio's treatment of prisoners of war when he was fighting against Carthaginian allies, he was incredibly benevolent to them, much like the Romans had been to their earlier allies in Italy, and this generated widespread feelings of support among the Spanish tribes that Scipio and the Romans were the good guys and that they could be trusted, and this was put to the advantage of the Romans by allowing them more men. There was also the amount of loot that was taken from, the Carthaginians are incredibly wealthy, and Spain itself obviously was. This granted them access to ships, to ports, to the silver mines, and weapons, and so this essentially resupplied the resupplied the Romans. Bear in mind, too, that within just two short years of the conquest of New Carthage, that the Romans were able to actually stop Hasdrubal's supply lines permanently at the Battle of Metaurus in 207, when Hasdrubal and his army were destroyed. If you recall from both the reading and the video, the way that Hannibal found out about this was because one day his brother's head came sailing over the walls of the Carthaginian camp when he was camped in southern Italy. Had the two armies been able to combine, Hasdrubal's army and Hannibal's army been able to combine, it would have probably completely destroyed the Roman Republic. All right, so now as we near the end of the Second Punic War, we need to look at a couple of the developments that take place. That was in 209, and then as we move ahead to 206, what you also find is that Scipio is put forth as consul. He's elected consul. The problem was that the Senate decided that they weren't going to give him any funding for troops. For some reason, they were kind of concerned that he had been so successful. This is something we'd seen on the Carthaginian side before too, and so even though Scipio was consul, they weren't really giving him the command. So Scipio raised his own army of volunteers. He asked the Romans and others, and there were veterans and a whole series of soldiers that were currently serving that all decided to serve with Scipio. So they all volunteered. When it's patriotic and for the benefit of the Republic, it seemed great, but this was also going to start a trend that was going to be a bit troublesome in the next few centuries. So what does Scipio finally do? He decides to muster his troops and invade North Africa in 204, and he brings the war to Carthage. And that actually is what allows the Carthaginians, or forces the Carthaginians, to pull Hannibal out of Italy and forces him to return. Before Hannibal got there, Scipio had made alliances with Massinissa from Numidia, who was a Carthaginian enemy, and so this allowed him local troops and others who had knowledge of the lay of the land. Scipio also apparently did something a little bit deceitful. One of the Carthaginian allies, by the name of Syphax, who was an enemy of Massinissa as well, had set up a camp, and Scipio had gone to this camp under the idea that perhaps they could negotiate a truce, but it turns out he really wasn't there to do that. He was just there to spy. And one of the things he noticed is that the barricades around the camp were all made of wood and reeds. So later that night, what he did was he sent men in and set fire to the walls of the camp in just certain places, and when the armies rushed out the soldiers rushed out to put the fire out, Scipio and his men were waiting there in the darkness and attacked them and slaughtered them, and so destroyed a massive section of the Carthaginian army, or at least auxiliary army. When Hannibal finally does return to North Africa, the two of them meet at the Battle of Zama in 202, and Scipio is victorious. Even though Hannibal had been the victor in numerous battles, now Scipio is, and he's granted the victor's name of Africanus. So now he's Scipio Africanus. Scipio, the conqueror of Africa, even though it's really just North Africa. And so in 201, then, the Carthaginians sign a peace treaty. If you recall from the film that Hannibal, he flees the battle, or he's able to escape the battle, and he actually ends up leading Carthage as its political leader for quite some time until he's later expelled, which kind of goes beyond the scope of this. But he doesn't die until 183, so he's alive for another almost 20 years. Anyway, the Romans decide to set up a peace treaty with Carthage, which is incredibly burdensome for the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians are denied all overseas territories. They cannot make war without Roman permission, and they basically become a client state. Their fleet is reduced to 10 ships. Remember, they had a massive navy and a great seafaring power. The Romans also demand that they pay 10,000 talents as a war indemnity over 50 years. And that basically is 14.8 or $15 billion that the Romans, or that the Carthaginians have to pay to Rome. And that is a lot of money that is going to go into the coffers of Roman society. So with Carthage basically out of the way, what's going to happen, as you can sort of see on this map here, and what's going to basically happen is that the Romans are going to turn their attentions to the east, to places like, and again, hopefully this cursor is working, to places like Macedonia, Illyria, Pergamum, so all these areas of former Greece, and then eventually out here as well, the Seleucid Empire. These are places that the Romans are going to move into very, very quickly. When you turn to the east, what you find in the east, in the eastern Mediterranean, are a series of kingdoms that have been left after Alexander the Great, who had died in the late 300s. So the Hellenistic kingdoms after him included Egypt, which was ruled by a group called the Ptolemies. Ptolemy had been one of Alexander's generals. Modern-day Syria was ruled as part of what's known as the Seleucid Empire, and Macedonia was under the control of the Antigonids. So these areas had been part of Alexander's great empire, but he hadn't left an heir, and so they'd broken up and had been essentially kind of in competition, or at least standoff, ever since. Here's a map that you can see of the Eastern empires and the areas that had been, all this territory had been conquered by Alexander, but you can see that it actually had broken up. You see Egypt wasn't just Egypt itself, but bordering on the Carthaginian territories. So it goes through Libya and Phoenicia, and far to the south you have the Seleucid empires, and then Macedonia and the other Greek territories. So when the Romans decide to move east, I'm basically just going to give you a quick summary of some of the things that happened. And the bottom line is lots of meddling by the Romans, although it's not completely self-serving the entire time, and a series of wars that take place. Bear in mind when you look at these dates on many of these things, they are either occurring between the First and Second Punic Wars, or in some cases with Macedonia at the same time as the wars with Carthage. So what is known as the Illyrian Wars, and you can see Illyria in the top left of your map there, just across from Italy. There's a series of wars that Rome fights there, 229 to 228, 221 to 219. And what's interesting about these is that Rome, even though they're fighting the Illyrians during this time, they end up declaring peace with the Illyrians, but they do not end up establishing any sort of garrisons in these territories. So they do create allies there. Their bigger problem is going to be Philip V of Macedonia. You can see Macedonia pretty much in the center of your map there. And this is going to lead to a series of 4 wars with Macedonia. Not always with Philip, because he'll be dead by the time the final wars take place. Philip, if you recall from any of your readings, was actually allied with Hannibal and the Carthaginians, and the Romans did not forgive them for that. And the Romans actually had to fight a second front while they were fighting with Hannibal. Technically a third front. They were fighting in Spain, they were fighting in Italy, and then eventually they fought in Macedonia. And part of the problem is that during this time when they're fighting Carthage, they just essentially fight Philip to a draw. And so that's why you have this long period, 211 to 205, the First Macedonian War. It kind of just ends in a draw between the two sides. The Second Macedonian War, though, has to do with Philip V of Macedonia pretty much overreaching his bonds there. He is stretching out into a lot of territories of some allies of Rome, but also meddling in all these different states in the east there. And if you notice the date, Romans have finished with Carthage by this point and concluded a peace treaty. And so even though they're in the process of rebuilding, they really don't want anyone else sort of rising to power on their back doorstep and causing problems. And a couple of the sort of advantages as to why the Romans would actually even want to deal with that. I mean, obviously they say that there's security, but it increases trade. They can make more contacts in the east. There's a lot of loot to be had because the east is incredibly wealthy. Slaves, that's something we're going to be talking about later, the rise of or the enhanced rise of slavery, the number of slaves that are coming in as prisoners of war, money, but there's also military ambitions too. In the end of the Second Punic War, with no wars in sight, it kind of people have lost the opportunities to gain glory, but only for about a year, because as you'll see, this one goes on for another 4 years. There's also the advantage too of military leaders, people like Scipio and others. You saw how important the veterans were for them. When political leaders support military activities, the generals end up being able to call upon veterans as very useful clients. This is going to become even more and more important as we move further ahead. So what happens at the end of, or the Second Macedonian War, which is again just a summary, Macedonia has to pay an indemnity to Rome, so they pay Rome money. They get their army reduced, and Macedonia is going to be used as a buffer against other states. So they kind of become somewhat of a client state to Rome. It should be pointed out, too, that when the Romans are there, they are actually discussing these ideas and why they're there with the other Greeks. And so one of the consuls, Titus Quinctius Flaminius, as he is moving in and out through the territory of Greece and making the case for why Rome is there and working against Macedonia, makes the common refrain of freedom and self-determination for all Greeks. So the Greeks really expect that the Romans are going to come in, remove Philip, or at least hamper Philip's efforts to stifle their systems of government and provide a bit of freedom. We'll take this up in the very last section, which is coming up next.